What I want to talk to you about are lessons learned and best practices from our experience. And I have 12 of them here, and I keep tinkering with this because they change over time and they change with events. And while we haven't had any of the super spectacular crises that we've seen in the past, we have had, and all of us who are speaking today have responded to a number of crises that have been pretty horrific. And out of that experience, we come up with best practice. So the first one I would mention, and these are not in any order of importance, is to build organic resilience. And what is organic resilience? Well, resilience is the ability to bounce back. And when I use the term organic, I'm talking about bouncing back from within. One of the things that we found from recent crises, and actually going all the way back to the 9/11 attacks, is that if something bad happens, we cannot sit back, call 911, and wait to be rescued, particularly if it's community-wide. So if we have a worst-case scenario, a worst-case weather disaster, a worst-case man-made disaster, it's important that we recognize that we're the first responders. And we have to be prepared to deal with that crisis for at least the first hour or so. This typically is what occurs, the kind of feelings that occur following a crisis. And this is, again, been pretty well documented, but I think if you think about watching things unfold on television, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is a good example. The first reaction from management was surprise. This wasn't supposed to happen. The rig wasn't supposed to explode. Okay. Then, they're saying that, well, maybe it's going to dump out, 500 gallons of oil a day. Then we get to the point where they start to really understand how exposed they are, and it's not 500 gallons a day, it's 20,000 gallons an hour, or 20,000 barrels an hour, excuse me. And at that point, they recognize we have to do something, but we don't know what to do. That confusion, and then finally, but we better do something now. Probably that was more clearly demonstrated with the Costa Concordia accident, where you saw clearly all those phases occurring with the company Costa and with the parent company Carnival. They went through all of those phases with this situation. So the question then comes up, what happens, we look at that and people will say the immediate reaction is, you look at that ship rolled over in the water, it'll never happen to me. And they probably said that at Kilroy's in St. Louis last Saturday after they beat the Brewers and had this tent set up. The building on the right actually is Busch Stadium. They had this tent set up. They have a couple of hundred people packed in the tent. They knew the severe weather was coming. They had warnings about severe thunderstorms, yet they took no precautions. They wind up with 1 fatality and 16 injuries. And as I mentioned, they were probably saying, we can do this, it'll never happen to us. Second is making the transition from a reactive disaster response plan to a proactive business continuity plan. Essentially what I mean here, when we talk about disaster response or emergency response, the terms tend to be interchangeable. We're talking about the response to a single event. We do a lot of work with commercial aviation. When airlines talk about emergency response or disaster response, they're talking about an airplane crash. We're saying that we need to go beyond that we need to take much more of an all hazards approach and consider any one of a number of possible scenarios that could interrupt our business. Right now, about 30% of companies in the United States, give or take 5%, have enterprise risk management or all hazards business continuity plans in place. As I said, it's a more holistic approach and really takes into account human capital resilience as well as continuity of business operations. And this is a big deal because if you go back as recently as 10 years, when we talked about business continuity, we were talking about IT systems and IT disaster response plans. And there was no attention paid to the human capital issue. Now people are much more tuned into the fact that their most valuable asset is their human resource. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated the systems are, without protecting the human side, they're really doing a disservice to their business. One of the questions we will ask folks when invited to bid on business is, tell me about the maintenance agreement you have on your computer system, and people will talk about it. And then we ask, is that comparable to the maintenance agreement you have on your employees? And there's silence. And the two don't equate. So we're advocating here that the approach include that. when we talk about business continuity planning, though, people think that that's a real mysterious, very complex process that involves highly paid experts. It's actually a risk management process. And in risk management, you only have 4 choices for strategy. And when we get to the point that we understand that we only have 4 choices, it becomes much, much simpler. And the choices are risk acceptance. If you're in the airline business, you accept the risk that there might be a crash. Okay. There's risk avoidance. I was on a flight a month or so ago, asked for a cup of coffee, and they said, we no longer serve hot beverages. Okay. They are avoiding the risk of me spilling the coffee and suing them because it was too hot by just taking coffee off their airplanes. Risk transfer is nothing more than insuring a risk. You get fire insurance, some of you have business interruption insurance, and then finally, the strategy that most people use is risk reduction. What can we do to reduce the risk of something bad happening? Okay. We have metal detectors at the airport to reduce the risk of somebody bringing something inappropriate on board. We do other kinds of things to reduce risk. That's the most popular strategy that we find in business continuity planning. The third best practice is to practice evacuation, shelter in place, and lockdown on a regular basis. We find that people have really good shelter in place plans. You look at Jay's plan, it's tacked on the wall, it's in your packet for here. The plan is worthless if you don't practice it. And I know for a fact that they do practice at this facility. But it's also now practicing shelter in place, letting people know where they go in a severe weather event, and lockdown because of the proliferation of active shooters in the workplace. And that's really what it boils down to. In fact, there are so many instances of active shooter around the country that now if it's regional, we don't hear about it. You know, if something's going on in Florida, it's not reported here. Something goes on here, it's not reported in Texas. So it's happening a lot, and we encourage that kind of practice. We recommend tabletop exercises and full-scale drills, but I would say that, you know, you can't practice too much. And we find organizations get great benefit out of tabletop exercises. And a tabletop simply is people sitting around a table talking through their role in evacuation, shelter in place, or lockdown. There's something about saying the words out loud and hearing your colleague's role. You say the words out loud and suddenly it becomes clearer. And you say, you know, you can be going through your process and people will say, wait a minute, there's an easier way to do this. Or I'm listening to you and I'll say, you know, you're doing that, I'm doing the same thing, we got some duplication, maybe we can streamline this. Tabletops, we find, are extremely effective devices and much more cost-effective than a full-scale drill, which, as you know, if you do a full-scale drill real time over a 2-hour period, that gets mighty expensive. We recommend walking evacuation routes. A couple of years ago, I was in New York working with an organization that was on occupied floors 34, 35, and 36 of a building on Park Avenue. And I walked with the risk manager down the stairs. And didn't really want to do that, but we had to do it. And what we found on lower floors was that people were using landings for storage. People were putting trash bags out on lower floors. There were all kinds of things blocking the stairwells. And so just that walk, the risk manager was able to call the building manager and say, you got to get this cleaned out. And finally, we would recommend that everybody needs to be involved in these drills. Interestingly, another drill in New York, supposedly an unannounced drill, that somehow somebody leaked to the C-suite folks and somehow did the evacuation drill, and they were all down in the Starbucks on the first floor having coffee just at the time we did the drill. How about that? The issue there is that they had no idea how to get out of the building. It's basic human nature to leave a building the way you came in. You know, for most of us here, if somebody said get out, we'd all go out that front door. But there's an exit here, there's an exit here, and if the fire or the event is in the front and you go that way, you know, you're going to have a tough time getting out. So knowing evacuation routes, knowing where they all are, familiarization with evacuation and shelter in place and lockdown will increase the chances of surviving an event and avoiding injury. Fourth best practice is that we need to get to understand disaster behavior, and this has become much clearer since the 9/11 attacks. And in fact, there were a number of researchers, organizations that started looking at the question of why people survived the attacks in New York and why some didn't. And those were longitudinal studies, and those studies are complete, and we've seen the results. And this is a very, very simplified version of results that in a major disaster event, 20% of survivors will step up and take some action. And those people tend to be people who have some background or some experience in dealing with crises. Yes, ma'am?
Joe, this is perfect. This is my question. When you mentioned Costa Concordia before, immediately my question was, how do you deal with a leader that freezes?
It's, you know, again, it goes back to practice. One of the things we would recommend, or one of the things we've seen that works, is you have a leader, but you also have a backup person. And actually, the best practice is go 3 deep. So if the first person is injured or becomes immobilized, number 2 steps up. You know, if number 1 and number 2 are injured or immobilized, number 3 steps up. But you have to have that redundancy and that backup. And I think that's the only solution. The other piece is practice, that you do the drills. Yes, go ahead.
So how is it decided then that leader number 1 is not leading?
Well, in that situation, if you remember what happened, leader number 1 fell off the boat into a lifeboat.
Supposedly.
Yeah, he fell off into the lifeboat, and that would be the time that number 2 needed to step up. But I think, you know, it's a judgment call. I wish I could give you a recipe, but it is a judgment call. One of the things we know about crises is that no 2 are the same. You know, you've seen one crisis, you've seen one crisis. So there isn't any recipe. And while I can give you some of this stuff that's based on research, you know, there isn't a precise recipe for dealing with a crisis. Anyway, getting back to this stuff, this is all taken from Amanda Ripley's work. And she's a writer for the New York Times, I believe, wrote this book, The Unthinkable. If you don't read another book on disaster management, I would strongly encourage you to read her book. It's available on Amazon. It's in paperback. It's about $10. It's an excellent book. But you know, the results they came up with, 20% of survivors will step up. And those are people who typically are former police, former fire, former EMS, combat veterans, have something in their background that triggers something and they know they have to take action. On the opposite end, 20% of people will become paralyzed and will do nothing. And then the 60% in the middle are waiting for leadership. Okay? And the key seems to be that if people have a mental picture, and that's what it's called, a mental picture of escape action, it can increase their chances of surviving a disaster. I can tell you that the NTSB has done studies on airplane crashes that go back 15 years. And they clearly have determined that if you know how to get out of an airplane, if you have that picture, if you pay attention to the flight attendant briefing, you have a 48% better chance of surviving an accident than if you don't pay attention. Because we work with a lot of airlines, people are always asking us, where's the safest place to sit on an airplane? You know, you see airplane crashes and the tail always survives. You know, so should we sit in the back? And some people say, no, you need to sit up front. Safest place to sit on an airline is within 5 rows of an exit and to be prepared to climb over seats to get out. Because when that plane crashes, more than 50% of fatalities are caused by post-crash fire and smoke inhalation. So it's important to get out as soon as possible. Goes along with the next best practice, when in doubt, respond. Don't wait. There is this myth that in a crisis situation, people will panic, become hysterical, bounce off the walls. Just the opposite seems to occur. And first-hand reports from the 9/11 attack confirm that people stayed calm. So calm, in fact, that they called home. They turned off their computers. Some people took 30 minutes to leave their work area. So again, going back to that 60%, it's important that when we practice, when we develop our plans and when we practice, that we have clearly assigned leaders who are the right people in the right place. And then finally, when the alarm sounds, it's time to get out quickly. Don't turn your computer off, don't grab your purse, don't put your shoes back on, get out. One of the things that we found, again, at 9/11 was people taking their time getting out, combined with not practicing evacuation. Now, some businesses did practice evacuation, and many of their employees survived. Some did not, and the opposite occurred. But one of the great lessons from 9/11 is have a plan and practice it, and when the bell rings, act. I think anytime we do business with 2 professional sports leagues, so we're covering a lot of sporting events. And there's an analogy here that if you go to a baseball game, you go to a Brewers game, people there may come to 1 game a season, they may come to every game. It's likely the majority of people who are there don't know anything about this stuff. So you really are relying on your leadership that if you need to get people out, that the leadership is the one constant. In your case, the full-time permanent staff are the constant. And that you recognize one of the challenges we have is getting people out who may not be familiar with the facility. I think that's the only solution that we found. That, and periodically you do a drill so you know where the bottlenecks are and where the problems are going to occur, and you can anticipate what's going to go wrong and maybe deal with that. But the key is going to be your full-time staff. We certainly find that to be the case with all of our professional sports work, that you cannot rely on seasonal employees. You have to rely on the permanent folks who are the constant in all this. And still, the challenge is getting people to respond. But the practice would indicate that people who step up and take a leadership role, that 60% will follow. Okay. That question is, will your employees evacuate quickly and safely? Another best practice, develop a system to respond to the massive numbers of inquiries that can occur following a disaster and can overwhelm internal resources. One of the things we know, there aren't many absolutes in this business, but one of the things we know will occur is that after a high-profile crisis, if I believe I have a family member or a friend who was involved, my first impulse is to pick up the phone and call the organization and see what's going on. That happens constantly. A good recent example of that was the Indiana State Fair, the stage collapse last year. It was who was the concert? Sugarland. I'm blocking Sugarland. Okay. People saw this on TV. Okay. And anybody who had any family members at the state fair, whether they were going to the concert or not, was calling. And that quickly overwhelmed their ability to respond. Typically what happens in those scenarios is that people will call, they can't get through, they get a busy signal, they don't get anything. The next thing to do is get in their cars and go to the scene of the crisis. And what does that cause? It causes gridlock so that first responders can't get through. And that's one of the things that happened here. And then the last thing people do, when they can't get through, they can't get any response, they perceive the organization as being indifferent and insensitive, they contact their elected officials. And before you know it, you have legislation or investigations that lead to legislation to regulate how you're going to handle your concerts, which is what's going on in Indiana right now. Okay, so again, if you have employees or guests and they're on the news that you had a fire or an explosion or a shooting or whatever, are you equipped to respond to those inquiries? Do you have a mechanism in place? 7 is understand the importance of social media. This is a new one. And if you're like me and you didn't grow up with social media, this has been really tough for me to get my hands around. And there are a couple of things. Social media changes the direction of information. I'm used to getting information from broadcasts. Now, my kids are getting it peer-to-peer. They're getting it from their friends, which tends out to be more accurate, certainly more timely. To the point that the old assumption that the public who's tweeting and Facebooking is a pain in the neck has to evolve to the public and employees are a resource, and we need to use that resource in the best way we can. This is a classic photo. I'm sure all of you have seen this. What's the number? 1489, US Air 1489, Miracle on the Hudson, Captain Scully, everybody's heard the story. What we didn't learn quickly but came to light is, people out on the wings, a number of those people are tweeting what's going on. One of them is being interviewed by Matt Lauer on NBC, live on the spot. What's the message here? The message here is, if you're going to do a press release, you sure better not try to stonewall it or lie about it, because it's not going to work. Other crisis media relations issues, mass casualty means mass media, and mass casualty. According to the National Transportation Safety Board and the FBI, mass casualty can be 2 people. But you're going to have media if you have casualties. Large incidents, other than natural disasters, are going to be assumed immediately to be criminal. And we go through a process now where we rule out criminal activity when we have a plane crash or an explosion. Third one, the media will get it wrong. The media, everybody wants to have it front page above the fold and win a Pulitzer. And in their attempt to do that, they'll get it wrong, at least initially. So you'll have to deal with getting the factual information out there, and we know we only get one chance to tell our story. And then finally, and maybe the most ominous, is that everybody with a smartphone is a reporter. So everybody now, all of you have iPhones and BlackBerries with cameras, you're now a reporter and can deliver the news firsthand. Number 8, providing information is the best weapon against fear and confusion. One of the things that we've learned is that survivors, survivor families, and victim families feel isolated and out of control after a crisis. You know, the police are calling the shots, the local police, the state police, feds are calling the shots, you know, DHS may be involved, the organization is involved, the victims and their families, you know, are being pulled in 10 different directions, and they feel out of control. And what we know is that victims and their families, more than anything else, want information. That getting information helps them feel more in control, and they want to get it firsthand. They don't want it from the media. They don't want to hear on TV what's going on. They want to hear from us, you know, those people working for the organization, what's going on. Number 9, understand the consequences from using employees for site remediation and recovery, restoration of personal effects, and even identification of human remains. Ken is going to talk more about this later. Suffice to say that there are still organizations. I'll give you an example that's very recent and timely. And I can't tell you the organization, but I will say that some of you may be aware that there was a crash at an air show last year. I cannot mention the name of the organization. But the first responders and the people who were initially on site to do recovery were folks who worked for the air show. And we're now hearing that those folks are really suffering, at least some of those folks are really suffering. They saw stuff they never should have seen and experienced things they never should have experienced, and it's come back now, and they're hurting because of that. It's important, we know that from dealing with victims, that personal effects become very important. But we need to leave to the professionals the recovery and restoration of personal effects, if no other reason, because of hazmat considerations. And finally, we want to avoid having our employees become additional victims of a crisis, which is what will happen. Recognize not everybody plays nice in the sandbox. Yeah, I thought that was a classic photograph. Crises, the larger the crises, the more political they become. If those of you who can remember TWA 800, you know, crashed off Long Island, and first Rudy Giuliani got involved, and then the governor of New York got involved, then the president got involved. Then the FBI said it was a missile that shot it down, and then I remember Louis Freeh, the FBI director, would not back down off that. Ultimately, they conceded that it wasn't a missile, that it was a center fuel tank. But that stuff happens. The other thing that complicates stuff is that there's mutual suspicion between the public folks and the private folks. You know, the private sector folks, you know, think the public folks are just interested in getting reelected and getting FaceTime and that kind of stuff. The public sector folks think that those of us in the private sector are making millions of dollars and, you know, we're just looking to fund our retirement and ripping them off. And that kind of colors the relationships when you go into a crisis. And then, talking about playing nice, there's the issue of families. And family members who have a victim of an accident, whether that's a fatality or a casualty, can get very feisty about what they think they need and what they think they deserve. You know, we've done some plane crashes where people have said things that have caused us to coin a phrase where we talk about the grief and greed syndrome. You know, yeah, you know, I'm going to come to the crash site, and you know, it would make me and my family feel a whole lot better if you flew us all to Disney World on the way home and paid for a week there. I mean, people legitimately ask for this stuff. Anyway, moving on, avoid supply chain dependence. This is one that we found recently too, that we need to think about supplier diversity. It's all well and good that we have a really good plan in place that we practice and we know well. But if our major suppliers, particularly sole source suppliers, don't have business recovery plans or emergency response plans, we're still stuck. So it's important that we even recommend build into every contract that the vendor must have an emergency response plan and has to demonstrate its effectiveness to you so that you go and watch a drill. You get a chance to look at their plan. And if necessary, you may have to help them develop their planning. And then finally, And this probably says it all. You've got to hope for the best, stay optimistic, be prepared for the worst, and also be prepared to be surprised. There are a number of us in this room who've responded to large-scale disasters. I think it's safe to say everyone has been different. And just when we think we've seen everything, something new occurs. We have to recognize that no two crises are alike, and Murphy's Law absolutely exists in crisis management. If something can go wrong, it will. And not only will it go wrong a little bit, it'll go wrong a whole lot. And then finally, I'm going back all the way to the beginning when I talked about there's 4 steps that we need to focus on. Anticipating what can go wrong. You know, what can happen, what can go wrong. And how do we respond to that stuff? What's our first response? We are the first responders. Then how do we manage our way through a crisis? We only have one chance to tell our story, one chance to get it right. And then finally, recovery. And what we now know is that when we talk about recovery, we're not talking about recovery back to normal. Because if an organization has a large-scale event occur, there's going to be a new normal. Things will never be the same. So it's getting back to a new normal.